I didn't bring props. Sorry, that's good. Yeah. That's what I heard. So I drove in from Vermont last night. I'm from Philly, and I worked in DC for 11 years. And I realized I've completely forgotten how to drive in cities. So if any of you were stuck behind a Civic with Vermont plates that was totally lost, I'm sorry. And you might be stuck behind me again when I try to leave this afternoon. All right, so thanks for being here. This is, as Peterson said, I'm talking about a new book. It's a very nice cover, very affordably priced from Cornell Press, if anyone's interested. You can check it out. So in Monty Python, the Holy Grail, right? King Arthur's knights are struggling to find the Holy Grail to achieve their quest. They're stymied when they come up against the dread Rabbit of Caerbannog, right? This fearsome beast. Don't know what to do. So they ask their resident cleric. He brings out the holy hand grenade of Antioch. King Arthur counts 3, tosses it. Everything's solved, we think, right? And a lot of countries around the world seem to think or hope that religion would work like this holy hand grenade when they get stuck in tricky areas of power politics. Right, so you have this difficult balance between advancing your interest, maintaining your morals, or areas where you're gonna take a policy, enact a policy, but backlash is likely, so you appeal to religion, and it resolves the problem for you. And we can see various examples of this. Right? So Madeleine Albright, former Secretary of State, professor at Georgetown, wrote a great book, The Mighty and the Almighty, one of my favorite books, but talked about the potential for religion to be a tool in US foreign policy. That there's downsides to religion, but a lot of positives as well if we learn how to harness it. See this outside the US context, after his defeat in the first Gulf War, Saddam Hussein of Iraq, even though he'd previously repressed Islamists, tried to present himself as this Islamic hero, comparing himself to Saladin, the great warrior of the Third Crusade. Built things like this, the Mother of All Battles Mosque with sort of missile-shaped minarets. Some of this was for domestic purposes, right, to maintain legitimacy after his humiliating defeat. But there's also international implications, right? He was appealing to Arabs throughout the Middle East to rally to his side after his defeat. We've seen more recent examples. China, despite technically being officially atheist and communist, has been promoting these Confucius institutes, drawing on Chinese culture and religion to spread awareness around the world. Maybe support for China as a result. So we can see a lot of examples of this. Many examples of states taking religious seriously. This raises a few questions. One is, why are they doing this, right? Second, which I'm going to focus on here, is, do they actually have any sort of impact on the world? Do they matter? I think it's interesting that they exist in the first place, right? But ideally, we want to see them actually changing international relations. And there's pretty big stakes, right? This question matters. Because there's two sides to debate on whether religion matters in international security power politics. A lot of the study of religion and international security, which is where I come from, is interesting. We've accomplished a lot, but it's stuck in this sort of triumphalist mode. Religion is just going to transform international relations, reshape power politics. States will change what they care about thanks to religion. It's not really true, and we struggle to really demonstrate that. Security studies, and I'm not going to say all of security studies, but significant amount of security studies kind of just pretends religion doesn't exist. When we look at studies of America, Russia, Saudi Arabia, main cases in my book, a lot of them really avoid getting into the religious angle, and I think that's a problem. We're missing a lot of what's going on. Okay. Policymakers, meanwhile, just are flailing. So when I was in DC, I worked with the Pew Research Center and other places. There's a whole lot of interest in incorporating religion into foreign policy. We had working groups, we had roundtables. They had no idea what they were doing. Right? A lot of money, I mean, not compared to a lot of the military budget, but a good amount of money is being dumped down the drain on these initiatives. And most of what happened was sort of preaching to the choir, right? No pun intended, but we'd have these events where everyone in the room would agree that religion is really important, and it would never actually have an impact beyond that. So gaining a better understanding of how religion matters, if it does in power politics, is going to influence a lot of areas. So the main takeaway of this talk, right, in case you need to leave early or you're in the elevator later, you want to chat about it, is that these appeals to religion and power politics are a potent tool for states, but they're unwieldy. It's hard to keep them under control, and more often than not, they produce effects that aren't what states desired. All right, so what I'm going to do here is talk generally why and when they matter. We're talking about, provide one of the cases from the book, talking about Saudi Arabia in the 1960s, and then some broader implications. Okay. First, what am I talking about? Right, so religion can matter in a lot of ways in international security. Specifically, I'm talking about religious appeals, which are these references to religious standards and symbols in official pronouncements or debates the states use to justify their policies or go after rivals. So power politics, then, this is talking about building or disrupting international coalitions meant to advance a state's interest. Some recent interesting work on power politics says a lot of this involves conventional military instruments like threats or alliances, economic interests like sanctions, but there are also cultural and symbolic instruments states use to draw people to their side or take apart enemy coalitions. And I argue these religious appeals are one example of these cultural or symbolic instruments. Okay. So why would they matter? Right? The starting point is just they matter because religion matters a lot. Right? It's a huge part of most people's lives around the world, their identity. When you appeal to something like that, it's going to have an effect. It's going to resonate. It's an assumption, but it holds up with a lot of evidence from my study, other studies, and the evidence from the cases. That being said, though, religion is incredibly complex, incredibly multifaceted, so we'll see a variety of effects. Some of these are expected. Some are what the state wielding the religious appeals wants to occur. You might persuade the target regime. You're trying to get them to join a coalition. You frame your appeal in religious terms. And, oh, sure, I'll go. That sounds good. Some might be more domestic. Right? So the leader might not really care. They might not listen to your religious argument, but it resonates with the people. They agree with what you're saying. They want to join your cause, and then they'll pressure their leader to go along with it. A lot of the effects are going to be unexpected, not what the state wielding the appeal wanted to happen. Religion's very complex, as I mentioned. So appeals to religion are also really complex. Any religious argument can be twisted and turned in many directions. As a result, it's easy for the target of the appeal to twist it, to turn it back on you, and criticize you. So you can lose control of the messaging. It can raise the stakes of the dispute. The stupid joke, like, don't talk about religion and politics, Thanksgiving, whatever, but it's true. You're having a negotiation over trade, it's tricky enough, but then you make it about deep-seated religious identities or beliefs. How do you get out of that? This raises the pressure in the room, the blood pressure. Finally, a lot of Western-dominated international statecraft is secular. It involves, reference to realpolitik, state interests. If it does talk about ideologies, it might be liberal, secular ideologies, environmentalism, secular human rights. So when people start talking about religion, they're a little confused about what's going on, don't know how to respond to it. If you try to form a religious program or initiative, you don't have a lot of basis to go off of in terms of judging its effectiveness. It might be unfamiliarity with what's going on, and also just misdirected, wasted resources. So this is what we're going to see, different effects, expected, unexpected, and they're going to vary. They're going to vary. You see two main variables, right? One is how credible the wielder is. This is partly due to their themselves, right? Their background, their history, their culture, their behavior. Are they acting in line with the religious values they're espousing? Or is it sort of stretch? And then does it fit or resonate with the culture of the targets? Flip side is we don't look at the material incentives of those being targeted by the appeals, where it's not just about religion. Do they have a reason to go along with what the state's doing? Are the religious appeals and the material incentives working together or against each other, cross purposes? And so when they're both there, right, credibility and incentives, well, then we'll see big impacts of the appeals. When they're both absent, we won't see much. Most of what's happening, though, the most interesting stuff is these intermediate categories. So you have a low credibility wielder, right? Someone who's making these appeals, no one really buys them. But there's reasons to go along with what they're arguing. We might create a coalition, but it's going to be shallow, easily broken, and easy for the targets of the appeals to turn them back on the person wielding them. Flip side, you've got a state that's pretty credible on the religious issues, but there's mixed incentive. The states they're targeting are wary of going along for other reasons. Because everyone involved is maybe hoping or worrying these appeals will resonate and change behavior. But the bigger impact will just be to raise the tensions and the stakes of the dispute. Okay. That's the basic idea of when they're going to matter. How I looked at this, it's qualitative. Looked at a couple cases that are cases we would expect to see religious appeals matter, but also cases where we expect to see the alternative explanations, conventional security studies, also matter. Meanwhile, these cases are really different in every way besides the significance of religion. How I did was I looked for evidence, right, that would basically be unlikely to exist if I was wrong. This is sort of Bayesian process tracing, people like Andrew Bennett have worked on. And I used diverse sets of data. Some of this was pragmatic based on what I could find. There's also some validity here, is that I'm not depending on one data source for everything. All right, so that's the basic argument, how I think it's going to work. I'll give you one example of this from the book, Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia, many people who talk about religion as a tool in foreign policy and international security point to Saudi Arabia as an obvious example. One key aspect of this was 1960s, this attempt to form an alliance or an Islamic pact among conservative Muslim states to counter Nasser of Egypt and his Arab nationalism. But as we're going to see, this case actually highlights how tricky and complex things get when you sort of toss the holy hand grenade into an issue. So just some background, right? This is a period some people call the Arab Cold War, emergence of Arab nationalism, just challenging Western dominance in the region, but also challenging conservative monarchies. So on the one side, you had Saudi Arabia, this conservative, pious, officially Islamic state, led by King Faisal, a very personally pious man, respected by a lot of conservative Muslims in the country. Also outside of the country, after his assassination in the 70s, the Grateful Dead dedicated one of their albums to him, Blues for Allah. One of my greatest successes so far as a professor is getting a Robert Hunter citation into a book past the editors. Don't tell them. I think they didn't notice it, right? But very well-respected man on the Saudi side. The other side is Arab nationalism, sort of secular, critical of Western intrusion in the region, seeing the conservative states as, tools of the West, of imperialism, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, president of Egypt. So you have this competition going on, right? It's about state interests. But each side saw the other as an ideological threat, a threat to their regime, their ability to expand their influence in the region. So they're competing over influence over Arab publics and states. This wasn't a religious conflict, right? The Saudi goal was to preserve its domestic stability, advanced its interests, but it drew on religious appeals alongside other tools of statecraft. So you see various examples of this. In a 64 meeting between Nasser and U.S. foreign policy officials, Faisal and U.S. foreign policy officials, Faisal said that Nasser did not believe in God, and thus had no standards of honesty. Right? So trying to convince audiences to follow his side rather than Nasser's because of the different views in religion. We saw propaganda being used, right? Stressing Islam as a defense against what is called godless communism. One U.S. official said that this banner of Islam had clearly been waved as a direct attack on Egypt. So using this as a tool in the statecraft. And this is important. It's not just lip service. It's not just, cultural issues that weren't tied to real security concerns. Nasser connected this, right, to the civil war in Yemen, which became a proxy struggle with Egypt. He sent his brother, Prince Sultan, to the United States for help. U.S. officials were like, this is kind of a big deal. He's sending his brother here directly because of this ideological struggle with Nasser. And there are also indications on the Saudi side where they knew that America was annoyed by some of their appeals to religion in this conflict. Right? They knew they were going to face some costs from their ally, but they kept doing it. So one of the major areas of this was this Islamic pact, this attempt to form an alliance among conservative Islamic Muslim states against Nasser. So King Faisal traveled around Middle East and Africa, Turkey, Morocco, Guinea, Mali, Tunisia, elsewhere, calling on Islamic solidarity. In one speech, he said, "This appeal displeases some circles and some evil powers. I'm absolutely sure the Muslims will join forces and cooperate with this just cause and with piety." We're directly tying this alliance, this struggle to Islam as a way to take down Nasser. Observers noted this, basically sees it as sort of a counter ideology to Nasserism. One U.S. citizen who is close to the Saudis, kind of a shady business figure that still exists, actually. I talk about Faisal's trying to rally the Arab world to resist Nasser's radicalism by evoking the spirit of Muslim faith. Observers said this basically they're treating this Islamic pact, these appeals to Islamic solidarity, as a weapon in the diplomatic arsenal. That was a quote. So Islamic pact was treated as a serious initiative by Faisal and the Saudis to go after Nasser. So I would say that's, I could kind of stop here, right? Is that we see the case here of religious appeals mattering as a serious security tool by the Saudis. So the bigger question is, did it actually have an impact on anything? Answer is yes, it did. We saw some support from conservative Muslim states. So like King Hussein of Jordan, pictured here. So yeah, that sounds okay. There's some expression of sympathy. The Shah of Iran said he responded favorably to Faisal's appeals. There's a limit to this. The pact actually never came together, so that's a big thing. Outside of Jordan and Iran, there's sort of polite interest, according to observers. And beyond that, Jordan never really accepted Saudi leadership unconditionally. Jordan got frustrated. They weren't getting enough money from the Saudis. That was sort of what they wanted more. They were hesitant at one point about letting the Saudis run a unified military command over Jordanian forces. So Saudi Arabia didn't solidify its control over Arab states. Meanwhile, America never really went along with it. U.S. officials said that Faisal grossly exaggerated the impression of communist bloc presence. They wanted to keep him happy but not go too far. So there's a sort of dismissive thing where they said, let's just give him a top-level pat on the head every 6 months. Keep him happy but not actually cooperate. Other cases, America was actually getting openly annoyed with some of Saudi Arabia's efforts, saying you're causing problems here. So the pact didn't come together. People were sympathetic, but the pact didn't come together. But it freaked out the other side, freaked out the more radical Arab states. They were really anxious about what this meant. They saw it as trouble. Right? Cairo said this was a move to align reactionary powers against progressives. Nasser, president of Egypt, accused Faisal of being a traitor to the Arab cause. US intelligence assessments talk about this Islamic pact heightening Nasser's distrust. Egypt sent Anwar Sadat, then the vice president, to America to ensure America was not supporting and part of this Islamic pact. So Egypt was nervous about what this meant. Other Arab states and organizations responded more strongly. Syria condemned the Saudis as reactionary. So this appeal for Islamic unity is directed at Arab nationalists. At one point they said this is part of a broader war on the Arab people. In '66, the meeting of Arab communists talked about they want a unification of all efforts of national and progressive forces in the face of this Islamic alliance. So we're seeing that stirring up, that increasing the blood pressure in response to these religious appeals. Not the effect the Saudis wanted, but still a major effect. Right, so what does this tell us? Well, clearly Saudi Arabia is using religious appeals as part of its power politics, right? Struggling with Nasser for influence, afraid of Nasser provoking rebellion in Saudi Arabia and other states. One of the ways they countered this was through appealing to Islam and then appealing to Islamic solidarity via this Islamic pact. Okay. But it wasn't the only thing that mattered. It didn't erase other concerns of targets of states like Jordan. And then the effects, as I said, were not really what Saudi Arabia wanted to happen. The pact didn't come together. America didn't buy it. But in this already incredibly tense region, Middle East in the mid-'60s, tensions increased and ratcheted up even further thanks to Saudi appeals. So why was this? Looking back to that 2x2, right? We all love 2x2s, international relations. We had this very credible figure on religious issues, right? King Faisal of Saudi Arabia. So when he spoke on them, people listened. They took it seriously. However, the targets of these religious appeals had mixed incentives. They were afraid of countering Egypt, which at the time was the biggest material force. They were afraid of stirring up and angering their own domestic audiences, which are sympathetic to Arab nationalism. So they felt sort of stuck. And everything sort of just ratcheted up and increased. So that was the Saudi case. I'm not going to go through everything in the whole book. It's a teaser. You can check out the rest if you want. But I looked at other cases. I looked at America, United States in the global war on terrorism, our attempts to promote moderate Islam, in quotes, use religious engagement to form a coalition with Muslim states and societies, the more conventional stuff, or contemporary stuff with Russia, appealing to traditional values, to increase support in the West for Russia's dominance, the Ruski Mir, the Russian world. And generally what I found there was similar dynamics. Right? Similar dynamics. The religious appeals had impacts. Some of them were in line with what the state wanted to happen. But for the most part, they're unwieldy. In the American case, this is where I mentioned the flailing policymakers. We wasted a lot of money on programs. A lot of Muslim audiences didn't quite buy that we were, had their best interests at heart when we were also bombing and arresting Muslims, things like that. Russia did form far-right networks throughout Western Europe and America, but also really polarized a lot of opinions on both Russia, but also Russian Orthodox faith. We keep seeing examples of this. So they sort of spin out of control whenever they're used. Okay. So some broader takeaways, wrapping up and bringing this together. So go back to Monty Python. So I don't want to spoil the movie for you, but it is really old. It's older than I am, so I think it's okay to spoil the ending. Use the holy hand grenade to defeat the rabbit. Everything seems right. They're about to find the Holy Grail and achieve their quest. Unfortunately, however, earlier in the film, a historian had been killed by a knight that was probably one of King Arthur's troop. And then the police raid the set, arrest everyone. This is Lancelot being arrested, and they go to jail. So the grading didn't really solve all their problems. It might have actually blinded them to the complexity of the situation involved in searching for the Holy Grail. I admit I might be pushing the metaphor a bit here. And I initially tried to have this be the title of the book, A Holy Handgrenade, and the editor said no, because various reasons. But I think this is what happens when you use a holy hand grenade in a tense power political situation. Right? It's going to have an impact. It's going to have a big impact. Occasionally, we can find cases where it works out the way we want. I found like 2, and I talk about them briefly. But for the most part, it's going to cause problems. So what does that tell us? Right? For security studies, I guess I could just say study religion more, and that'd be great. But another thing I think it tells us is we need to shift what we think matters. And so I gave an earlier version of this talk at a conference a while ago. Very senior, rationalist / realist was in the audience. He's like, so nothing happened though. Like they didn't start a war, they didn't form an alliance. And I was like, okay, fine, that's right. But 99% of international relations is not wars or alliance formations, right? It's this tense diplomatic back and forth. And this is where religious appeals, and I'm sure a lot of other cultural instruments of power politics matter. Let me expand and think more about how that works. In terms of religion and IR, again, this is my area. This is a post-tenure book, which meant my editor said, feel free to piss people off. And so, we need to do better in religion and IR, right? We make these sort of broad claims that don't often hold up. There's a limit to what other cases we can find of religion causing war. It's like the English Civil War, right? And what else? And one problem, though, is a lot of work in religion, international relations, and security is hesitant to go with more like positive, explicit theorizing, right? So when I reviewed the literature, very few people wanted to lay out the variables under which religion mattered. And that's something we need to do more of. Okay. Ideational approaches, this is sort of constructivist, post-constructivist, however you want to call it. They do a lot of interesting work. They use variables and stuff. But they tend to focus on nice, happy ideas. So it's ideas will lead to cooperation. Ideas will minimize the stress of a rising power. But a lot of the time, ideas cause problems, right? And they don't explicitly theorize this as much. And I'd love to see more of that. Beyond that, this is the post-tenure book. So the first book, dissertation, was, you make narrow, readily defendable claims, basically to get past the job talk, and get published. And I try to be a little more expansive here, but there are some broad claims in this book, and I think we can explore them more. So I found some examples of religion increasing blood pressure in international relations when it's infused into power politics. Can we find that in a more systematic sense? Can we look at international statecraft and what happens when religious NGOs or actors start using religious language? How do people respond? And this is where we can leverage a lot of interesting new methodological advances, right? This book is qualitative. This sort of work doesn't have to be qualitative. So, I'm using some work in network analysis to try to get a more fine-grained understanding of religious politics. And there's interesting work on scraping the internet, computational text analysis by Professor Nielsen here. Right? And that can give us better ways to leverage all the incredible data out there to look at this process of international security. Okay. Finally, just talking about the policy implications of it. I'll explain why Reinhold Niebuhr is up here in a second, although you might have already guessed, those of you who know Niebuhr. We can't ignore the potential values of these appeals, right? They're often locked away in literally the bottom floor of the State Department. But they matter. They can be of value to us. Whether or not we want to use them, states are using them against us, right? We're getting ready for an election here in America. Watch to see what Russia does. So we need to study and understand that. How do we do that? And one is U.S. credibility. Right? This is the big limitation we ran into in the war on terrorism, so no one took it seriously. So how can we expand our credibility when we speak on religious issues? There were some efforts at this under Obama that fell apart later. There's also the idea of religious literacy. So when I was in DC, I would sometimes teach a class, session of a class at the Foreign Service Institute on basically religions for future Foreign Service officers, and making that just as much as their education as economic issues or nuclear doctrine. Okay. Those matters as well. But the bigger takeaway, this brings us to Niebuhr, right, is that we need to be modest. Again, religion matters a whole lot. But most often it's going to matter in ways that no one likes. And so we have these great ambitions. The Bush administration was going to promote moderate Islam. Obama administration was going to, fix the world's negative image of America thanks to the Bush administration by speaking at Cairo University. That's not going to work. So we have this sort of narrower, careful policies, that may have a better impact. So actually another working title of this book was From Virtue into Vice. It's a quote from Reinhold Niebuhr. The idea that we think we're doing good by infusing religion into our power politics, but it often turns into a vice or a problem. Okay, so that's it. Thanks for your attention, and love to hear your questions or thoughts.
Thanks, Peter. You can have a seat here, I think. So I think the talk seems to be like a lot of cases, but they all sort of tend towards the middle where there's some impacts, but they're not predictable, and it's sort of a messy middle. But I was just wondering, just for the audience here to help us, can you tell us one case where it worked the best? An actor wanted to use a religious appeal, and it was very effective, the most effective case, and one where it looked like it lined up like it should work, and just went awry. So just to...
Yeah. Yes, I mentioned I found a couple where it seemed to work. One is the Holy See, which is borderline, but it is kind of state. Under Pope Francis, there is when he first came to office, or whatever you call it, there was growing interest, calls to intervene militarily in Syria, and he organized this transnational peace effort, right? Talking about holding peace vigils in the Vatican and elsewhere. Talking about this religious imperative to not fight and not invade or bomb Syria to stop this horrific civil war, and it basically worked. And so there's one where he was incredibly credible on religious issues, even among non-Catholics and non-Christians, and then it lined up with the material incentives of a lot of states where they're sort of hesitant to go along with this. And this is a tricky one, right? Because on the one hand, he built a coalition, but he also took apart a coalition. And this gets to some of that messiness, the process of power politics that we need to pay attention to. So that's one where it seemed to basically work. One where it didn't. So I mentioned Saddam Hussein and trying to build himself up as this Islamic figure. This started in the run-up to the Gulf War, trying to get other Middle Eastern states to support him, and that didn't work. No one really bought it. I think the states that did was Jordan. A lot of that was due to fear of refugees, but also Hussein's popularity among Palestinians. Jordan's big Palestinian population. Although that one also gets to some of the messiness and trickiness of this question, because later on, Hussein's image and credibility grew as he faced his punishing sanctions from America throughout the 90s, and even though the Saudis technically won in that rivalry, right, they kind of later lost on in terms of popularity. So it's hard to find really clear-cut cases, which is
I guess that's part of your punchline.
Yeah.
Questions, Rich?
That was quick.
Well,
yeah, it'll surprise no one that I have a lot of thoughts, and I'll see you at lunch. I love it. How should I think about the following issue? So the success story you just told, you literally have to be the Pope. Which, which is like that's a pretty restrictive condition. But well, it's quantity-wise a small number of people and states. And Saudi Arabia under Faisal is like getting closer to being the Pope. It's not quite, but when I think about a range of, where is the executive leadership of a state that's making foreign policy decisions, and where are the religious authorities within a state, those are like about as close as I can imagine drawing them on a spectrum without being the Pope. So I want to hear more about an interplay between the state and the religious actors. And what I'm intuiting is that most state actors have no credibility or limited credibility when they make religious pronouncements. And that part of why religious actors, there's a strategic game. Religious actors don't want to lend themselves to the state in this way, if they can help it, because it undermines their credibility. A different way of saying is that, like, you're talking about how religion impacts power politics, but then involvement in power politics undermines religious actors' authority, and they're very cautious about doing so. So yeah, like how are the religious actors in the cases? I know some of it's in the book, like how religious actors ended up going along and like making these appeals. But I'd like to hear more about that strategic situation in the cases you looked at.
Yeah, comparativists always kind of mess with international relations.
Yeah, sorry.
That's right.
I mess with everything.
Yeah,
so.
that's right. No, it's a valid point. And so some of it does, the part I didn't talk about in the book was this idea of the moral authority of religion varying, Chris Booz's book, in different countries. And that does come from historical factors, but also the strategic factors of these religious groups getting close enough to influence politics, but not so close. And then that gets tricky, right? So in the case of Russia, right, where after the end of the Soviet Union, the Russian Orthodox Church kind of blew back into the public sphere, primarily in conservative, right, politics. And so they've benefited from Putin working with them, but then you see occasionally some of this pushback. And so one of the things that I don't think I got into in the book as much, but I'd love to explore more is kind of what happens next and how this is it's a dynamic process, right? And so, like, let's look what happened next with Faisal, right? Islamic Pact didn't come together. Everyone was freaking out over Arab Cold War, and then I didn't talk about Israel, right? So 67, right? A year later, we had the Six-Day War, June War. Arab nationalism lost. Faisal was the dominant force, and some of that was the fact that Egypt was devastated militarily, and then Nasser passed away, right? But some of that was ideologically Arab nationalism had failed, and so I think it sort of primed the pump for, and then oil, obviously, right, mattered as well. But it sort of primed the pump for the ideological shift. So I do think we're going to see some of that. And, in America, again, a different interesting case there where Bush didn't come out of nowhere, and so we had these sort of the rising evangelical activism and interest in politics tied in with the neoconservatism as well. And so I think, yes, so it's a tricky strategic element, and I think, sort of what we saw, with the Russian case was a few times where people would actually start pushing back on Orthodox, like, recognition of festivities in Eastern Europe countries seen as a Russian support. So it is, yeah, I agree with you. It is sort of this interesting strategic dynamic.
Well, Rich brought up the power of the Pope, and there's Putin, which is quite a powerful figure. Carol, I think you want to come in on this?
I just want to jump in.
Yeah.
I think you should look more carefully at the Russian case, because my reading, especially since 2014, is that the Patriarch has been one of the major pushers, major advocates for the war against Ukraine. They wanted the property of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, etc. There are schisms within the church, and I don't think it's clear at all that there's any kind of blowback against the church. The other point I would make is Ruski Mir to me is different from the appeal of orthodoxy, if you're talking about religion. And then it's different again from the appeal to the conservative values that they're trying to play up, which leads them to support some of the right-wing forces in Europe and here, as a matter of fact. So I think that there's a real role that the church is playing, and I don't see the blowback from Putin. If anything, I think Putin could be in trouble if Kyiv suddenly disappeared from the scene.
So yeah, sorry. The blowback is less so much in Russia, but against Russia and the Russian Orthodox Church. Right? I think like the split in the Ukraine Orthodox Church. There's something in Sweden just recently, some pushback on the Russian Orthodox Church getting involved. And the idea that when churches politicize themselves, they gain something, but they also lose something. And that's usually a domestic story, but it's international as well. In terms of what the risky mirror means, I think you're right. But it's sort of what is Putin trying to accomplish by appealing to traditional or conservative values, and it's forming these far-right networks to give him more space to dominate their former Soviet space.
Well, Navalny was buried in a Russian Orthodox service. I mean, there's only so far you can push if this is the identity they have, right? And so the blowback has to be also related to just the alternatives for identity within a state, right?
Yeah.
At any rate, to get in on that. Kelly Greenhill.
A couple of my questions were sort of asked, but so the first one's going to kind of lead to a statement that you can address as an answer to a question, and the second question. When you made the statement that Bush was not successful, that didn't surprise me one way, because of course he's not going to be credible with the audience that he sought to persuade. So apropos of what Rich was saying, have you thought about unpacking credibility to think about who is credible under what circumstances, and maybe is it part of the problem is that some of these actors have too much hubris about how much credibility they will have with other audiences because there's only one pope, even though some people might think that they should have this credibility for other sets of reasons. So sort of, can you say a bit more about credibility not as a single variable, but what goes into what makes a message credible or not, and why I'm wrong? The second question, or the real question is there learning across cases, or do you see learning within cases about what worked and didn't work? So we know internationally or transnational actors who rely on other identity appeals learn from what has worked in some places and not other places. Do you see any evidence of learning or failure to learn in the religious context?
Yeah, thanks. So for your first part, I don't think you're wrong. And I struggled with whether I want to say it's just never going to work unless you're Pope Francis. Not even the Pope, but Pope Francis. And I don't want to go that far because even with Bush, right? There was some cases of, Muslim leaders or religious figures saying, his speech to the Islamic Center helped to cool things down a little bit, right, and provide some commonality there. But the broader ambition is where's the problem came apart. And so in terms of unpacking credibility, this is something I thought about. And one of the initial ideas was to do the typical quant 3-case study, book like my first one. And it is very hard to come up with quantifiable measures of credibility across cases. And so, in terms of Bush, the credibility in terms of is he actually a religious person? Yes. Is his language speaking to the audience Muslims? Not really, right? And then does the broader foreign policy line up with what he says he's doing? And not really, right? And so there's I think it was a Weekly Standard. It was called.
Credibility comes from authority, and authority that's very context dependent.
Right.
So Bush could have tremendous authority with a particular audience, that same audience, on a different topic, but maybe not in this.
Yeah, that's possible. No, I think that makes sense. Yeah, thanks.
Barry Posen. No, Kelly, go ahead. Sorry.
On the learning?
Oh, sorry, learning. Yeah, so yes, you're right. So actually, the case with the longest time horizon in this case was the U.S. case, and we saw some of that. This shift from Bush administration to Obama. Towards the end of the Bush administration, there was this recognition that finding the moderate Muslim scholar to stop Al Qaeda is not going to work, right? And so they started moving more towards religious engagement and dialogue, interfaith efforts. And we often think of that as starting with Obama, but actually did start under Bush. And there is some commonality of officials across the two. For that reason, so I think they did learn. And then there's a sense in the Obama administration, some of the people I talked to, that we had overemphasized the religious aspect of a lot of extremism before. And so we downplay that, still finding common goals. So Yeah, I mentioned the positive stuff from the State Department. The Office of Religion and Global Engagement under Sean Casey was meant to focus on religious issues, but not security-wise. And so that was an effort. Of course, that was cut under Trump. So I think we did see learning in that sense. I would love to do follow-up and looking more at how Putin's strategy changed currently. But you're right. Yeah, learning is part of it too.
My question is a bit inchoate and jumps a little bit off Rich. I wonder if there's a fruitful distinction to be made between religious appeals that have a pan movement quality to them. So, like we have pan nationalist movements like pan-Slavism or pan-Arabism. Mostly pan movements don't work out very well. Religion, as in the case of when Catholicism was stronger in Europe, if the Pope got into international politics, he could make trouble for you. So when that kind of appeal is mobilized, that's a threat to the internal legitimacy of all other countries that have that religious identity at their core. It's inherently threatening in a subversive sense. This is sort of analogous to Steve Walt's argument in the Bounds of Threat book. But then you have different appeals to nationalism that have or to religion that have a more ethno-national quality to them, where religion is very tied up with the ethno-national identity, and there's not an inherent subversive quality to it, but it can have a different effect, which is it makes the leader who's mobilizing that in his or her own country appear perhaps stronger, maybe more domestic support, maybe more inclined to absolutes about what is and should and should not belong to them. So it seems to me that depending on which way religion is mobilized, whether it's mobilized in terms of the pan movement, which is obviously a question associated with the facts of the case, is there even one you could join, versus this other property, which I think is a little bit more like we're trying to get at the Ruski Mir. It has a different set of ripple effects. Both may make others view you as more of a threat, right? But the pan movement makes everybody view you as a threat who's in that community. So I'm not surprised that the Saudis didn't get much help, because had they gotten it, it would have been conceding to Faisal, as the closest thing to the Pope, a legitimate right to intervene in all their domestic affairs, which would have been nuts, right, for any state to do. So I'm just wondering if you think there's any traction in this distinction.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And so one of the limitations I raised later is, right, I'm talking about mainly Christianity and Islam. That's one thing, is both more universal religions. But there's also the question of nationalism, like the earlier question on Russia. And I do raise this as a counterfactual. Like, so if Putin had just tried to dominate the former Soviet space without talking about LGBTQ issues and all these traditional values and getting American conservatives online, would he have succeeded? And I wonder if yes, right? Because that wouldn't have raised the same ire of so many people in Western Europe and America. And this comes up a lot, with studies of terrorism. Like, we talk about religious ideologies. There's a difference between global religious ideologies and religious nationalism. They have different impacts. I think that's valid. Although I do think that once you move from nationalism, which is, delineated by a space or a region, what have you, to religion, which is going to push back on that, we're going to see a little bit more different effects, and it's going to have a broader resonance. But that's an empirical question, I guess.
We have some people in the queue, but I want switch gears a little bit and just try to get at some of this at a little lower level. And so we have a lot of military fellows that served in Iraq and Afghanistan. We have military chaplains. They're maybe used to talk with the other religious people on the ground. The interesting thing about the U.S. in the Middle East is it's actually not our religious appeal to like fellow Christians. It's de-Christianizing what we were trying to do. And that if I teach a class on emotions and politics, and I show Bush's speech after 9/11, and there's great effort to say Muslim or Islam is a religion of peace, and this isn't the Crusaders, that this kind of thing. But on the ground, I'm just curious to bring some of the military fellows in. What were you seeing, and what was the role of our chaplains, and can we get our own rhetoric about de-Christianizing why we're there and why we're not Crusaders? Was that effective, or is it just like, wow, this is just an appeal that is not working at all? Marcus, you must have some idea on this.
Can I think for a minute?
Yeah, sure. Anybody else? But I just want to sort of bring this. I find, and what you brought up in your talk about the Pan-Arab versus Islamic, the Pan-Arab movement is like a flash in the historical pan, and it was really quite a failure, I think. And Islamists are not going away. And it's because some of the religious identity does have this resonance, which I think the language identity and the historical identity does not, which makes it very impactful, like you say, but also because religion can be used in so many different ways. You can read the Bible in a million different ways. It makes it unwieldy. But maybe you can just talk a little bit about the de-Christianizing kind of rhetoric the United States tries to use here in invading and occupying Islamic countries.
Yeah, I mean, so there was that idea under Bush of sort of, right, as you said, but the goal here is the fight is not, Christianity versus atheistic communism like we had in the Cold War. It's the shared value of moderation versus extremism. Right? And then Obama tried that as well with the appeal to the Muslim world or Islamic world he had at Cairo University. But we slip up sometimes, right? So Bush did use crusade in one of his speeches by accident. That doesn't work out well. And then this question is, to what extent do people buy it? And some people would say, like I talked to, say, yeah, we would find like small scale cases of people would be a little more willing to talk to us as we tamp down language, but there's this baseline skepticism and wariness. And so, the chaplains issue came up. I had mostly interacted with State Department people, but I did some work with the Berkeley Center at Georgetown, which is Center of Religion, and they had a big initiative on looking at how military chaplains could be used not just to minister to our own troops, but as sort of interfaith engagement efforts. And as far as I remember, it was sort of a nice idea, but I don't think we ever got to the point of operationalizing and testing it. And that's the tricky part of it, right? Is how do we actually go to the next step and figure out how it works? And I can talk about frustrations with the DC foreign policy religion community, but I don't need to.
So, with what you just said, what I'm curious, because largely your talk, which I appreciate, is focused on geopolitical, geostrategic level. What effect did you find, if any, on the effect at the individual or, in the case of Iraq, community, tribe, these subgroups within the nation state in mobilizing based on the message that was intended?
Yeah, I mean, so the success stories I found in the U.S. case were those one initiative we had in Pakistan, working with a religious school to figure out textbooks that are still authentic to faith, but not promoting extremism or whatever we're going to say. And they appreciated, the U.S.-backed NGO working with them and the change there, or an FBI agent working with a mosque. It developed good information, and then one of the imams said, "Hey, we've got this kid who's looking into ISIS stuff. Can you come talk to him?" And there's that positive effect. Not enough to transform everything, but when we think about in the grand scheme of things how much those small initiatives cost, right? It's incredibly cost effective. And I was thinking of like, I'm watching The Wire for like the 8th time. I watched The Wire, but the TV show. But the message is like these big social programs are never going to work, but you can save like one kid or one community at a time, and that seemed to be where it worked. Which someone can say, well, that doesn't matter, right? That's not success on the scale Bush wanted, but it's still a success. And finding a way to shift our ambitions is what I was hoping for, and that's where the Niebuhr bit comes in.
And my assumption is that's largely applied to credibility.
I think so, right? So so like Institute for Religion and Diplomacy in DC is those groups that's worked with religious NGOs forever, gets funding from the U.S. government, but it's not like spouting the sort of fighting terrorism line, and they're seen as more credible then, even if the U.S. government's not.
I go back to Q, right? I think you were next.
So I was very interested in the case that you presented, and it made me think of Steve Walt's work, The Origins of Alliances, where he's sort of looking at the exact same period. And one of the takeaways I had from that book is this: he sort of argues that does ideology make states more or less likely to ally? His argument as well, these particularly universalist ideologies where everyone claims to be the leader sort of don't really work. And I guess my question, my curiosity, the thing that I was thinking about is, should we really, as IR scholars, just be treating religion as another flavor of ideology, the way we might treat liberalism, communism, fascism? Or do you think there's something particularly different about it as a concept? And then B, would you have different predictions or takeaways compared to a scholar like Walt about how religion should influence something like alliance formation?
Yeah, good questions. One of the critiques I get on this book and my other work from religion and IR folks is that I'm downplaying the importance of religion, which might seem weird in this room, but that I'm not saying religion is everything. And I did start out with the idea that religion is fundamentally different from nationalism, secular liberalism, whatever. And I still think that's right, but they do function in similar ways. The idea that you can appeal to nationalism, appeal to religion, it might have different empirical impacts, but it's not going to be like religion transforms and undermines all support for nationalism. And I think that's one of those big, broad questions we just don't like to deal with in political science anymore, for better or worse, because it's hard to answer. And so I just don't think, I found I don't get as far trying to make that broad case for religion. It matters enough that we need to look at it, but I wouldn't say it's to the exclusion of other things like nationalism. In terms of how it's different from Walt, like I've always had a sort of ambiguous relationship with the Waltian branch of realism, whatever you want to call it. Because on the one hand, so Origins of Alliances downplays these universal ideologies, but he also sort of thinks they matter in terms of the perception of the threat. And a book like Taming American Power does talk about role of ideas and things like that. And so I think there is a role to play there, but it's much more nuanced and careful. And so when I started grad school, I was thinking like this could be like a neoclassical realist thing, and then I was told that no one cares anymore. I don't know if that's true, and I'm sorry, that's just what I was told. But there's that thing is like, so to what extent do we get purchased by tying ourselves to one of these issues or not? But I wouldn't discount that. So I signed Taming American Power to my intro to IR class. I actually emailed him to ask him to update it because it's like 20 years old, and he said he's working on it. So I think you're right. There is something there, and I wouldn't completely discount it. But he also usefully pushed back on this simplistic idea that Arab nationalists will automatically ally with Arab nationalists. Conservative Islamic states will automatically ally with conservative Islamic states, which fits with what I found. So.
Just a couple of empirical things, just about religion and nationalism. Barry had this point. Being married to a Serb, there's no difference between the religion and the nation. To be a Serb is to be Orthodox, basically. And there's plenty of atheist Orthodox, which makes no sense if you're a Lutheran, but makes plenty sense in Serbia. The other thing about, in the Middle East, I'm shocked at how easily Baathists made themselves Islamists. in the Iraqi case. And it was like there's something powerful and drawing about religion, I think, that Wright's question is getting at, and way it stays in some place, but not all the places, which gets into your point about the messiness of how this works in different cases, I think. Phil Hahn.
Well, anyway, I appreciate this. I actually have Morgenthau's Scientific Man versus Power Politics sitting next to my bed. And so I appreciate this idea of pretty rational discussions of religion. The thing that I was anticipating when I was listening to this talk that I didn't really hear come out except in the Q&A was you had two expectations. One had to do with persuading a target. The second was mobilizing domestic policies. And I really want to ask more about that mechanism, particularly how, or when is the question you said, when will religious appeals motivate domestic audiences? And I assume you're talking about the target's domestic audiences, although they could be elsewhere. And how is there potential for blowback there, or when does it just fall flat?
Yeah, thanks. So I'll just start off. This is the preface. It's not a secret. Like, I started writing this book hoping to find cases of religious appeals mobilizing domestic publics, like Putnam's, reverberation and leading to durable changes in policy. I just didn't find a lot of it. And so that sort of resonance are those rare, few and far in between successful cases. So like the Pope, I think Iran is another example right after the revolution where it sort of mobilized Shia protests around the region, and then established these networks of like-minded groups more recently. And again, because we have the credibility of the Iranian regime on these religious issues, plus the fact that, I mean, they give them material support, but also these groups have reasons to work with Iran, the Houthis, Hezbollah, what have you. In terms of where it played in a lot of these cases, though, it's more the fear of that resonance, and that sort of fits into that second mechanism of raising the temperature, right? Where leaders know religion matters, they're worried about what the impact of the appeals will be, and so they're worried that their people will kind of rise up, put pressure on them in response to these appeals, which was sort of what was going on with Nasser and some of his anxieties, right? That as Saudi Arabia tried to form this Islamic pact, he worried what would happen in response. And it's that uncertainty is where I think it plays more. But no, I'll be honest, I was thinking I'd find more of it, and I don't, and that's why I think it's the intermediate cases are the norm, really.
Charlie Glazer.
Mine is, I agree that ideas matter and religion could matter, even though I'm also labeled a realist. But I did want to ask the basic material question, which is, in the case of Egypt, I mean, how do you think through what would have happened if it had not used religious appeals? Like, if I'm trying to form a coalition against you, and I get, I'm going to look fearful if I explain that I'm balancing against you, I'm gathering states. And so the fact that the Egyptians were worried about this, you said they responded very strongly. How do you separate out the potential, alliance dimension from it, or just the power aggregation dimension from the religious appeal? And on the flip side, the countries who were interested, although they didn't strongly align, like what were the geopolitics? Would they have naturally been inclined to loosely align against the Egyptians? And if they were, then how do you separate that out? I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but I mean, and I know you did the process tracing in the book, but it would seem like that's really the issue. And the fact that the coalition sort of formed, or started to form, but didn't, doesn't tell us how much the religion mattered. And so I would just think that that's the counterfactual that you need to put on the table in pretty great detail.
Yeah, thanks. So first, I just want to, as a good Middle East studies scholar, I don't essentialize realists or rationalists. I know you care about religion too, right? But beyond that, in terms of that sort of counterfactual, what would have happened if Saudi Arabia was putting together this alliance without talking about religion, just here's money or what have you? And we saw some of this discussion, right? So it varied. So Jordan was always sort of caught in the middle between the states, conservative monarchy, Arab nationalist, populist, and is always trying to balance everyone. Someone like Iran right, was the more conservative monarchy. They had an Arab population, so they were actually worried about Arab nationalist sentiment, and so they were kind of back on that. And then the U.S. State Department officials noted that Faisal seemed to be maybe intentionally going to what they called Nasser's backyard. So some of the African states that Nasser was also appealing to, or not Arab, but sort of African, Pan-African unity. And so, right, so I think there's different dynamics at play there. And that's those mixed material incentives that I was trying to get at. In terms of how do we separate out the religious effects from the non-religious effects, this is tricky. And in an earlier conversation with Rich, you talked about some of this, like, experiments and things like that to test the mechanisms. I think it's kind of like, what evidence do we think is sufficient, right? And so when I'm looking in the archives and I'm finding Egyptian officials saying, like, we're worried about Saudi outreach because of X, we could say, well, do they really mean that, what have you? But for me, that feels sufficient if I have multiple pieces of that evidence. Just like we think about, from a more, I don't know if we call it realist or whatever, angle, like if we find evidence, like Calculating Credibility, Press's book, where officials say, like, well, they weren't really as worried about credibility, it's more about material power in the archives. That seems sufficient. I think that's sort of how I was going at it. But then the causal inference bit is hard. And you're right. And this is probably why I waited till tenure to get it. But I do think the diverse pieces of data, the multiple pieces of data, I think provide enough evidence there that it'd be hard to make the case that this is all completely random noise. So thanks.
You bring up in your conclusions about how we should study religion and international politics, and this is something that's important. And I'm just curious what we do here in the political science department at MIT, and what if you get, I want to put some grad students on the spot. If you were to get an exam question at the end of it, beginning of your third year for an exam, what is the role of religion in international politics? How would you have answered it, and what is the literature that we're giving you that you might want to, that you would have approached it? Ben?
I think I will attempt to answer that while asking my own question at the same time.
Okay, go ahead.
So from your talk, I share a lot of the concerns from other questioners, which is how you disentangle the independent effect of religion, as Roger just said. And so specifically in the context of nations that change levels of religiosity over time, how should we expect that to impact their foreign policy? And so, you can think of nations that have a gradual decrease in their level of religiosity, like the United States and most other developed countries. You can think of nations like Egypt, which have a really sharp decrease between, Morsi and Sisi. And then there are nations that have gone from ostensibly secular states to very religious states, like Turkey and India. And in all of these cases, I'm really struggling to find a through line that's like, oh, this is what religion is doing to these states' foreign policy. I can see the effect, even though you have pretty sharp changes in the independent variable. And I guess that to go back from asking a question to answering a question to Roger, I would say that this makes me skeptical that you can say much about the independent impact of religion as compared to all of the other factors which influence how states approach international relations.
Right, you want to get on this?
Yeah, I'll take a really extreme position. I think you just answer the way you'd answer any ideological question. You'd say, as with ideological disjuncture, whether that's of a religious nature or a secular nature, is fundamentally the same. States are more likely to see each other as hostile if they have very drastically different ideological domestic institutions or structures. And so fundamentally, religion is not different in how it affects international politics and how states relate to each other than any other ideational approach to the world. That would have been my example.
Rich, is this what you're teaching all our students, that religion is just any ideology?
I don't get to teach a religion and politics class. I'm
Well, maybe you should.
stuck
if
on
you did.
scope and methods. So I just teach them, I teach them how to do case studies and such.
which is also.
I'll take scope and math if you don't want it anymore.
It's a more important religious class, as Barry points out.
Maybe not more important, maybe less important, but still religious.
I induct them into the religion of political science. That's true.
Well, just to pick up
That's
on
currently.
Ben, I think the approach, the most standard approach is, well, there's a dependent variable, which is impact, and then of course it's how to measure impact. And then you get a list of independent variables. And Ben mentioned one that seems, the level of religiosity in the state which is trying to make the appeal. I don't know what are the other, you mentioned you could study this quantitatively. Do you have a list of independent variables that are like that, or is this the right way to go about it? But you also said that you should look at process, and I'm not sure this independent dependent variable way of looking at religion, it fits into your idea about using process. So if you could talk about some of these issues.
Yeah, so I think great points, both of you. I think you're right in terms of the trick is finding that variation that lines up perfectly or relatively perfectly, and that's hard. And so one thing I've done in the past when I still do quant papers, a lot of it is cross-national variation, not so much in religiosity of the people, which doesn't really change, but religiosity of the regime, which is kind of what you're saying. The problem is that religiosity of regimes tends not to change much across time, except for these sudden breaks, like Morsi in Egypt, what have you. One interesting case that I think we could talk about is Turkey, right? So, when Erdogan came to power, we did see not a sudden break in Turkish policy. There's the Iraq War, but that was a lot more going on. But this reimagining of what Turkish identity means. This guy Ahmet Erdi Öztürk wrote a good book on this recently. On that we saw a shift in Turkish, the nature of Turkey's foreign policy outreach, or even in the '60s when they had under Erbakan, the brief Islamist government, we did see a change in terms of attitudes towards Israel and the like. Egypt's a tough case because it was so limited in what they could do under Morsi because of the U.S. ties, and then Sisi just sort of brought it back, and Morsi had like a year. But I think you're right, is finding that shift is hard. And so one thing I've been thinking more about is the idea of process, what Rich about is moving more towards a relational sense of, it's not like there's a set of independent religious variables we can input into an equation and then find a discrete outcome. However, a process of foreign policy deliberation that includes religious appeals will have unique elements to it, right? And so again, this question of evidence. When I find evidence that Saudi officials are using religion in their foreign policy, well, that's something. Why would they do that if it didn't matter, right? That's interesting. But the flip side is then if we find evidence that people are responding to it, then that is also evidence of impact, even if it's not that satisfying like war starting because of this variable. I think it's a different way of thinking, and I honestly like this is why this question of with grad school and my dissertation was much. I didn't try to make this grand claim about religion because it is trickier, and so I think your concerns are valid. I wouldn't go so far in saying there's no effect, but I don't know if you still do comps or not. I mean, that's a fine comp question. They got rid of comps in my grad school after I left, which is annoying. You have to write a paper now.
We had a debate about comps, and Josh Cohen, who used to be here, said that exams are an exercise in obsequious ass kissing. But Barry said we should have 3 or 4 exams, to make sure. So we had a debate on this. But just to go back on Ben, because I think how the rest of us think we're going to study this and how you're studying this, and religiosity in this, I would expect if I had this question on exam that a lot of students might be aware of Englehart's work on measuring religiosity and different orientations, and that would be a source, and we put that as a independent variable with this kind of thing, and then see whether it has an effect on something. But is that making sense for you, or that's just not really capturing the effects?
No, I think that does. So there's so Catherine Alexander has done some work on this, and she operationalizes it as religious commitment, but sort of using public opinion data to see how interested people in religion be a big part of it, and that corresponds to, I think it was more aggressive foreign policy, things like that. I'd focus more on the regime type and how religion's implicated there. Yeah, so I think there is something there, but even public opinion data is so hard to capture. This is when I was at Pew. This is like the secret they didn't want anyone to know is more and more. It's just, especially globally, it's not finding what we want it to find, and I shouldn't say anymore on that.
Why,
But
why is it not finding? What's the
well,
problem?
I
with it?
started. Well, the problem is it's just we're asking these very complex questions about your identity and your belief in God and where do we go and how does that relate to politics, and that doesn't translate well to a survey that was translated into a local language and to which you give a 1 through 5 answer. And so that's why I've struggled with public opinion data. Now, some of my friends do a lot of work on that, especially if you do like really fine-grained stuff, like a friend, David Buckley, who does work in the Philippines, where he's able to get like really good, valid opinion data so he knows what he's asking. And that I think that works as well. But cross-nationally, it gets harder. And I'm not making my case well for studying religion as a grad student, but
Marcus, you want to come in on this point?
So I just wanted to, before I start talking trash about chaplains, or say something relatively intelligent, to answer your question, I think it aligns with what your overall thesis is that chaplains are largely in the military focused inwards because the risk of it not going well by sending them somewhere and the message not being received is not worth the potential payoff. To the point of the Philippines, I was there last April and we sent a chaplain into a Mormon church, only to find out that was being used by the insurgents to funnel money to the south.
Wait, the Mormon church was?
Yes.
Oh, we gotta talk.
So that not going well had significant operational impacts with no intention for it. But in the case of the Middle East, I would submit I'm an outsider. So even if I get something minorly good, it doesn't offset the risk of something going really badly. And so that's the challenge with employing religion in a military sense, in my opinion, with regards to chaplains. And I think that aligns to what you're saying, just at a 20 rungs down the ladder.
And it didn't appear that we were ever planning to use the chaplains in any other way. I mean, our chaplain corps is still largely Christian based.
Right.
There's,
And
I
they're not
don't know
really
how
trained
many
for that.
Muslim chaplains we have. I know there's one woman Muslim chaplain. I don't know, we have
I
a
think there's
handful
2 in the Navy.
handful of others, but yeah, it was just, it has always been a inward facing, help our military members kind of deal with the traumas of just deployments and war and all the way.
Rich, you had a 2-finger on this, and then
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to waste too much time, but my take on this now, this general issue that Wright raises and Ben as well, actually comes back, I think, to the kind of on the ground issue where reading your book, Roger, which I'm doing, I'm struck that individual leaders of what you call hybrid organizations are really impacted by religious claims, but they have to and including by the US military at times. It's like, I believe you're a good moral person, even though we don't share the same religion, but there's some relationship here. Or the people I study got radicalized somehow, and that had to do with a lot of individual relationships, but it doesn't aggregate up into a regression on realist variables at the structural level, because it's 1 out of 100 has this really black swan kind of effect. It's just not a thing that you can put a cross-national statistical study on, which I think then means I wouldn't stop assuming that giving military folks who are interfacing across religions some religious background would be helpful, but I'd be skeptical of a program evaluation that's the average effect is X, because I'm well, you're not looking for average effects, you're looking for you try it 100 times and one of them goes the way you wanted and you don't end up with an Osama bin Laden, but how could you know that, right? It's such a low probability event. It's a cop-out way of saying I hear all the realist critiques that we can't, this doesn't create alliances. On the other hand, US foreign policy turned on the actions of roughly one religious individual for 2 decades or something. It's hard not to factor that in somehow and say there's some piece that's not quite being captured by non-ideological, non-religious variables, and you're trying to look at 9/11.
Kelly, you want to come in on this?
I would say what Rich said, but also what you said, Roger, but I think that also remakes the point that credibility isn't simply comprised of the ideology, the idea, but also the relationships and sources of authority come from things more than simply the raw materials. My two finger, however, was on the conversation that came out of what Charlie asked and what you were responding to in terms of how to test this and what Roger said. I don't think I remember you talking about the alternative explanations in the end. You said your cases were chosen to test your explanation against the alternatives. So what were the alternatives and how did your theory fare compared to what else we should have expected to see, or alternative explanations for the observed outcomes?
Oh, sure.
If you explain that and I happened to tune out at the moment, I apologize.
No, I didn't, and I love talking more about it. And this is like, the presentation is like the snapshot of the book kind of thing. But I mean, I put it as the religion skeptic, religion triumphalist is the sort of broad views, right? The skeptics is the sort of, well, there's the older, like, religion doesn't matter. Not many people say that at all anymore, but that, religion maybe matters for non-state actors or domestically, but not so much as in foreign policy or security. And then the triumphalists are the standard people I usually work with, right? That religion is transforming the international system, or more moderately, that it has this very clear, definite impact that we can tell. And we didn't quite find either of these, right? And so this is that question of evidence. If the religious skeptic view, I think, would expect to see that maybe there's lip service to religious appeals in these cases, but not a lot of resources put into them, which is what happened, or that no one responded to them, and we just, there's a joke, but that's not what happened either, right? So to be the religion skeptic for these cases means ignoring a whole lot of what was going on. The triumphalist view, though, would expect that, Bush wanted to spread Christianity, Faisal wanted to convert everyone to conservative Sunni Islam. The question about Putin, right? Putin wants everyone to be Russian Orthodox, what have you. That's not what we found either, right? And that the